He said, people are getting hurt up there. And I said, sir, I said, I'm 19 years old. Danger doesn't even enter into my vocabulary. Have you ever been talked to a kid who was 19 years old and said it was dangerous? What dangerous? It can't be. He says, well, that's what you really want. And I said, yes, sir, that's what I really want. So he said, come on, you're going with me. So I went to Charlie Company up on the line, and I loved it. That's what I want to be, where the action is, Sitting back there as a damn clerk. No, that didn't appeal to me at all.
From NCPR, welcome to Northwards. People, ideas, and conversations from and about Northern New York, Vermont, and beyond. I'm Mitch Teich.
Support for the Northwards podcast comes from the J.C. Steiniger and M.E. McDonald Charitable Fund at Adirondack Foundation, in support of the Adirondack Foundation, building stronger Adirondack communities.
Ethan Shanty is with us in the studio. Ethan joins us every episode before we start the interview proper. And Ethan, we usually kind of talk at random about sometimes nothing, sometimes something a little more focused, but we're not really, I don't think we're going to do that this week.
Yeah, we're not going to be especially goofy.
And that is because I heard earlier this week that one of the guests that we had a few months ago, I did the interview back in October. I think we aired it maybe in November or December, passed away. And I think it makes sense to revisit that interview, partly because it was just a good interview to begin with, and certainly to honor the memory of this guy who lived a long, full, and very interesting life. And it got both of us, I think, to thinking about how important it is to just bear witness to the stories that people can tell about their lives.
I am in the very, very rare minority of people who has a catalog of stories from my dad. And that's because we used to host a radio bit together at my last radio job at the country station, where he would call in. We called it A Minute with the Old Man. It was his idea. And I would call him every morning, and we would chat for like 10 or 15 minutes. And a lot of it was just, hey, how you doing? But when the segment started, he was just making things up off the top of his head out of whole cloth, because that's just the kind of guy that my dad was. And then eventually he kind of got sick of that, and it became like, I'm going to tell you real stories about things that happened. And it might have just been this goofy thing that happened in his day, but it also might have been this there weren't a lot of tender moments that I aired, but there were quite a few that I saved just for my own archives of him talking about being a kid and the hunting trips that he went on with his brother and his dad. And I'm very lucky now that he's gone to have hundreds of these conversations. I saved the edited and the unedited versions, and it always ended with me and my dad telling each other that we loved one another. I don't often go back and listen to them. My dad passed away, it'll be 6 years ago this month. Sorry, wow. But I am very glad to know that when I want to go back and hear my dad talk and hear stories about his childhood, and that I have them. And most people don't have that opportunity. And I think that people should go through greater pains to try to archive those stories and just talk to their parents and older loved ones, like, what did you go through? What was it like when you were a kid? How did you meet your spouse? And see where those stories take you, because they're invaluable. And when they're gone, those stories leave with them.
Well, and so this all comes around because some months ago, like probably a year ago at this point, I got an email from a woman named Bambi Niles, who mentioned that her dad, Harry Mitchell, had been writing about his childhood and about what it was like growing up in the Krogan area and managing the little power plant that was his dad's job. Yeah. And when his dad no longer could do it, he took over the job, and he fought in the Korean War. And he'd been writing about these things. She thought he would be a good interview. And I read the article that he had written. It was an article he had written for posterity, you know, to share with friends and family personally.
Yeah, he wasn't trying to publish it or write a memoir, really. He's just for dissemination within his group.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought, this is exactly the kind of story that we need to hear, because it tells a tale of what the North Country was, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. And so I drove down to Croghan last year to chat with Harry Mitchell, and spent a good couple hours in his living room with him and with Bambi, and had just a really interesting, enjoyable, warm time listening to him spin some yarns, if you will. And there was so much in that interview that we just never could air the whole thing.
Yeah.
But we pulled it together in what I think was a pretty interesting, half hour, 40 minutes.
Yeah, kind of getting like a cross-section of this guy's life.
Yeah, exactly. And so when I got the word just a few days ago that Harry had passed, it seemed to make sense to go back and revisit this interview. So let's go back and revisit that conversation now with Harry Mitchell.
It wasn't all a happy life. Basically, it was happy. I could go back over now and think of all the time living up there at Eafley. We were there. There was 5 of us in the family, and we lived right on the water, of course. The power plant was here, and the pond backed right up behind the house. And we spent all summer long in the water. We was swimming all the time, and Dad had made a raft, and we had it floated out a way so you could go out there and you could dive on. We just could. It was an enjoyable time. In the winter, winters became pretty dismal. But then on the other hand, the pond froze over. And then we'd keep teasing my dad, say, well, we want to go ice skating. And he said, well, you don't know if it's safe or not. Well, he had to go out first, chop a hole in the ice and find out if it was safe. And then I remember this term that he used. He said, well, the ice was probably that thick. And he come in and he said, well, there's 6 inches of ice will hold a team of horses. And I thought, really? I don't know what a team of horses weighs. I have no idea. But I know it was safe for us to go on. And I don't know what the limit is with people who know about that. They could tell you, they say, well, if ice is 4 inches thick, it's safe, or 2 inches, it's safe. But it's got to be 6 inches of ice. and then we'd go down, and so there again, in the wintertime, we'd scrape off and take the snow shovels down, and we'd shovel off a big area of ice. And then we'd skate. And we learned how to skate because we just did. And we'd skate until all hours of the night. In fact, it was nightly. If it was like last night or night before when you had a nice bright full moon, oh my God, you'd stay out there in the ice as long as you could. And the same way with swimming in the summer. We'd be in the water until Ma would be yelling at us that supper was ready, and she'd finally yell about the 3rd time. And then we better get in there and eat if you're going to eat. So, it was way back when my dad was working there. As I mentioned, he worked shift work. When he was on the 4 to 12 shift, us kids could go down there and play in the plant because it was open then. This is long before World War II and the panic that set in, And he would let us come in there and play. But at the same time, he said, no, you can't climb on the generators, and you can't go down in this switch room because they had some high voltage stuff in there. And there were certain places he said, you don't go. So you don't go because Dad said you don't. I remember one time we had a little red flyer wagon. Mm-hmm. Everybody had a wagon. And the number 4 generator, it was concrete floor, and the operators who worked there, they kept it clean and painted and shining. The goddamn floor was just glossy, and the brass on the machine, the brass fittings were all polished brass. They had nothing else to do, but the things were running by themselves. So, but we go down and we go around that generator with the wagon. Well, now, if you've ever ridden in a wagon, there's two ways of pushing it. Somebody can give you a ride, or you can tow them, or you can, I call it legging it, or one knee in it. You put one knee in and leg it, and you can propel yourself pretty good
Oh, yeah.
in that little wagon. Now, come time to stop, they did not have hydraulic brakes on those wagons. So the only way to stop it was to jam your foot in between the body and skid that back wheel. That's fine, that's fine. But when you're on a nice concrete floor like that, you're just leaving a black mark all along.
Used to do that in my basement growing up.
Did you really? Well, you know what I mean. But then next time you go down, that black would be removed. It'd be nice and shiny. And apparently my dad just cleaned up after us. And then again, we'd go down when Ma would fix supper. Again, on the evening shift. Whatever she cooked for supper, and then one of us kids would take it down to the plant and eat with my dad down there. So I spent a lot of time in the plant, so I was very familiar with it. When they offered me the job of going in there, I wasn't into a strange place. I mean, I was just going down there. I thought, hell, I know this place inside and out. I played hide and seek there. You know?
Well, and little did you know when you were playing hide and seek that someday you'd be operating the plant.
That's right. That's right. But who knows? Who knows what the future holds? But in any case, that was it. And my dad finally died, and I felt bad when because I used to, as I mentioned earlier, we couldn't mention cancer in front of him. Nobody could say that C word, you know. I remember he'd want to go out for a walk. He was in a hospital bed, but he was active enough. He wanted to get out and walk. So I said, yeah, come on, I'll go out. So I'd help him put his shoes on and his clothes, and we'd go out and go for a walk. And we'd always walk over to the top of the hill. There was 59 steps leading down to the plant. I counted them every damn day. It was 59 concrete steps going down there. And we'd walk over to the top of the hill, and he just wanted to look down at the plant. And he just would stand there and just look down at the plant and look down at the river going down and this way and that way. And sometimes he'd say, I just don't know why I'm not getting any better. And that really broke my heart, because I wanted to tell him, Dad, you are not going to get any better. This is it, man. Face it, you know. I mean, Christ's sakes, be honest with the guy. He was a grown man, and he'd been through a war and losing his own father and everything else. I'm thinking, he's big enough that you could tell him that. And he would just probably say, well, then, okay, and let it go with that. And that's what it is. But no, you couldn't say anything.
Yeah, this was 1954.
Yeah, that was in 1954, and he died of June of that year. And he could still walk around, but then we had a hospital bed from the Legion, and we had that old house. There was a back room, you might say, a back room or a parlor area, whatever. We had him in there, and then we lived out in the other room. And because my other brother was not a person to help you out much, and my mother was, she was a good lady, but she just was, I think if someone was sick, she was not good, you know. And I wasn't either, but the fact that he laid there in bed, then he'd have to get up several times during the night. And so I slept on a couch out in the other room, and it was a metal bed, an old hospital bed, but he would take his fingernails and he would tap on the metal. He'd lean over and he'd tap on that metal. I sleep. When I sleep, the guys in the service used to say, you don't sleep, you die for 8 hours, because I don't hear anything. Well, then he used to get disgusted with me because I couldn't hear him. And I thought, well, we got to rig up something for him. So we had a metal cup out in the cupboard for some reason or other. So I took a string and tied it to the bed thing, and now you could take that metal cup and bang it against the side of the metal. I'm pretty sure I could hear that. And so I had to get up several times in the night, and he'd bang his on the cup. And maybe he just wanted his pillow flipped over. Maybe he had to go to the bathroom, whatever. And It was hard for him, I know that, because he took care of his mother and father, his mother, and she had 10 kids, and he was young. He was like the second child born, but he was always doing something for his sisters. So he was a man who took care of somebody else. So it was hard for him to be taken care of. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know if you know somebody that's been in that situation. Maybe you are, you know. In any case, there was a time he wanted to go to the bathroom. So we had a coffee can, and I had to hold the coffee can for him so he could pee in it, and then, and so on. And I noticed at the time, maybe not the first time, maybe not every time, but this time I looked up at him, and as I was sitting down there, squatted down, holding the coffee can for him, I looked up and he had tears in his eyes, and I thought, this has got to be hard. This has got to be hard. It would be damn hard for me.
It must have been hard for you as his son.
I was, I don't know, my early 20s. But at that year, 54, I was 20 years old. I was born 22 years old. I was born in 32. Yeah, it was kind of hard, and yet, but because I felt so sorry for him, and then because here we are kidding ourselves, maybe thinking we're kidding him into thinking he's going to be fine. You're all right. All you got to do is sit in bed, and Harry will hold your cup for you. Here, hold that. But that's it. When I looked up, and he had these tears in his, and I never saw my father like that before. Never did. He was a strong man, and he was himself. You know. That was hard. That was just hard.
Well, and this was 70 years ago, but the way you describe it, it sounds like it was yesterday, and it's so vivid in your mind.
Could have been. Yeah, it could have been. Growing up at Eafley was, I guess I loved it.
That's 92-year-old Harry Mitchell, recorded on site in his living room in the Croghan area. And this is Mitch Teich back in the studio here on Northwards. We're going to hear another excerpt from my conversation, and our producer Ethan Shanty here again for just a minute. You know, it's funny, when I got into radio, I remember going out on a story with a coworker of mine in about, this would have been 1994, maybe 1995.
I was 6 or 7 years old.
Well, and the amazing thing is, we were working in Minnesota, and he was doing a story linked to the dedication of a World War I memorial in Minnesota.
Okay.
But he found a veteran of World War I who was living across the border in Wisconsin.
Okay.
So we drove like 4 or 5 hours, I think, to get to this guy's house, and he showed us his medals and told stories of World War I. And it didn't dawn on me at that point that, you know, I would be in radio long enough that the last of the World War I veterans would go, and there are just a handful of World War II veterans that are still, you know, telling stories out there. And Harry Mitchell served in Korea, as he mentioned in passing in the first part of our interview today, and you know, he's 92, and there are not a lot of other, you know, Korean War veterans out there that are left, and so I thought it was important to hear him talk a little bit about his service. So there's some gruff moments in here, and some scenes that might be a little difficult to listen to, but their stories well told, and I'm glad we have a chance to hear them.
I was trained as an artillery surveyor. I went to basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and I was trained to be a surveyor. Used an old girly transit, and we'd transit and go back and forth. I didn't, because I'm an obstinate bitch, I guess, but we were all in the field. Now I'm talking about basic training with these transit, and there's a highway going by. So I would, and you got wheels, you can turn this to rotate it, back and forth. And I'd look through the scope on the transit, and I would find a car going by, and I would turn the wheels and see if I could keep up with him all the way. Now that's my training. I didn't pay attention to anything. I had no real interest. I didn't want to be a surveyor. However, when I got out of there, I had the title of an artillery surveyor. When I went to Korea, I was in a mortar outfit, and I don't know if you know what mortars are. You drop the round down the tube.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course.
Well, they fired in artillery method. Consequently, I was an artillery surveyor. Well, I was a great candidate there, I guess. So, even though I had never seen a mortar in basic, I had never seen a mortar in my life. Had little idea what the hell they do. But anyway, we got over to Korea. We was in Japan, and we had to get assigned. They assigned me to the mortar battalion. So I went over, and everybody, we had a whole truckload of us, or we were just replacements, come into the battalion. And everybody was scattering around and running and going here and there. And there was several Jeeps and a 3/4 ton truck, and a bunch of guys would go over to this one, and a bunch of guys would go to that one, a bunch of guys would go to this one. They were all assigned and had their orders. And then when they all left, I was standing there alone. I thought, Christ, I feel like the last kid picked for a baseball team, Here I'm sitting here. And I thought, what the hell am I doing here? So I didn't know where to go. I mean, I was 20 years old, 19 years old. So I walked around, and I thought, well, somebody must know what's going on. So I walked around a little bit, and I see some guy come along. He had sergeant stripes on. So I said, hey, Sarge. I said, what are they keeping me here for? He said, what's your name? And I told him, and he looked on the list and so on. Oh, he said, I think the colonel wants to keep you here as a clerk. I said, as a clerk? You got to be kidding me. I can't even read my own writing. And there was no computers or anything like that. I mean, you had a handwriting. I said, oh my God. And the second thing, the most
And so did you end up being a clerk?
No, hell no. I told that sergeant, I said, listen, I can't even read my own writing. I know nothing about being a clerk. I don't want to stay here. And he said, I'm going to give you a bed for tonight. And then he put me on guard duty. I'm walking around with a goddamn rifle with it. Probably wasn't even loaded. I'm walking around. So he signed me to a place where I could get sleep. He said tomorrow morning, he said, go in and see the colonel. And he said, tell him what you want. He says, I'm sure he can help you. And I thought, yeah, you ain't sure. So next morning, I couldn't wait till morning came. And I went over to the orderly room, knocked on the door, identified myself. And I said, I want to see the colonel. Oh, okay, what did you want to see him about? And I said, oh, that's personal information, whatever. So pretty soon they said, yeah, the colonel will see you. So they opened the door and I went in, saluted the colonel. And he says, hey, son, how can I help you? Now he was being a nice guy. And that gave me the opportunity to be nice with him and not be standing there at attention. I think he told me to relax. He said, what do you need, son? And I said, you got me down here to be a clerk, a battalion clerk. And he said, yeah, that's right. Because he said, you were a surveyor. And I said, yeah, I took artillery basic surveying, but I can't tell you that I learned anything. And I said, I'm going to tell you right now. I said, I don't want to be a damn clerk. He said, I said, I can't even read my own writing, much less have somebody else read it. And I said, because I'm a lousy writer and I can't type. So I said, I've got no qualifications to be. He said, well, what would you like? I said, well, I just come out of basic training. And I said, I want to see some action. I said, to be perfectly frank with you, I said, I was taught to kill people. I want to go kill somebody. And I'm ready for it. He said, well, you know, you want to go up online? And I said, yeah, I want to go online. And he says, well, you know, that's dangerous up there. He said, people are getting hurt up there. And I said, sir, I said, I'm 19 years old. Danger doesn't even enter into my vocabulary. Have you ever been talked to a kid who was 19 years old and said it was dangerous? What dangerous? It can't be. You know what I mean? So he says, well, if that's what you really want. And I said, yes, sir, that's what I really want. And he says, okay. And that talked out of that. Well, next morning there was a Jeep out there, and then some kid come over and he said, you, Mr. Mitchell, or Corporal, or Private Mitchell? I said, yeah. So he said, come on, you're going with me. So I went to Charlie Company up on the line, and I loved it. That's what I want to be, you know, where the action is, you know. Sitting back there as a damn clerk. No, that didn't appeal to me at all. And there was underlying reasons. I had learned that in my basic and while I got a lot of indoctrination. And when you go to Korea, there was point zones in the 4-point zone. Now that's where battalion was in a 4-point zone. And then you go up to the company, and they're in a 3-point zone. But then you go up, if you're online, now you're in like a 2-point zone. Oh, no, so that doesn't mean anything except that now you have to, or they tell you that after you accumulate 36 points, you can rotate and go home. Well, you can't do the math very easy, but you know, it's 4-point zone I'm in down here. That you can figure that's 12 months anyway, isn't it? And now if you go up to company and they get a 3-point zone, it's a little less. But then you go up online, and you're out of there in a short time. So that's where I wanted to be. That's where I wanted to be. And I got up there, and I liked it. I really enjoyed myself. But yeah, you got in trouble sometimes. I mean, there was things I did. Like there was a gal down here the other night. She said something about being dangerous, and I said, you know. I said, I guess she was talking about Charlie out here is not feeling all that well. And, well, at our age, death is the next step, you know. And I told her then, I said, you know, all my life, and especially in Korea, I've faced death on several occasions. I've looked it right in the eye. And I said, it did not scare me. And I said, so it doesn't scare me today. I know that I might die right this afternoon, maybe. It's going to be hell on her. She'll be on it, but it ain't going to bother me none. You know, so I took combat was what it was. And I have something in my brain that makes me do these things, but maybe everybody does, I don't know, but if something happens, like if you all of a sudden you just drop your glass and it smashed all over the floor, oh my God, that glass broke. That happened, but that's past already. It's already done. I can't stop it. You can't stop that glass from breaking. So now you think, okay, that happened. Now what do I do to get out of it? Now what do I do? Now you pick it all up. So that's the way I always thought. And so when crap would happen in Korea and we'd get I wasn't scared. Just wasn't. There was only once that I was, but it goes into that. That's another story. But yeah, things didn't scare me. There was one time I was really, in fact, I was terrified. But that's the only time. But once I got through that, and
what terrified you?
Nothing scares me anymore.
What was the one time you were terrified?
Well,
if you don't mind my asking.
That's all right. No, I don't mind at all. I wrote it all down. I mean, it's common knowledge. All my time in Korea, with our motors, you had to have a forward observer. because we were behind the hill, and we always located the mortars behind the hill, and you were shooting over the hill at some target. But the only way you knew what that target was having a guy up on the hill looking around with a scope and telling you where you're going, you know. At the same time, usually you had to be a lieutenant, I think, to be a forward observer. I was a corporal. But I was also a radio operator, and then that's what they wanted the most, was a radio operator. So they said, you go up there, and so I got on we call it going up on the hill. I go up on the hill a lot of time with a forward observer. And this one time, we were facing the Chinese at that time, and it was no big deal. But I got a call from on the radio, you know, and here's this all secret stuff, and this is our colonel or the company commander down in the company. Called me on the radio and he said, "Do you see any new faces up there?" I thought, what the hell are you on? New faces? I got a bunch of Koreans around here, you know, they're, if you want to call them new. I said, no, there's nobody new faces or anything. Well, then I found out it was all secret. It was, oh my God, it was top secret. At 11 o'clock that night, or 2,300 hours, as the Army likes to put it, the 45th Division is going to relieve the 3rd ROK Division, ROK, ROK, Republic of Korea Army. And they were our people we were with up on the hill. 11 o'clock at night came, and there was nobody in there. I mean, we didn't have any. Where was the relief that was supposed to be here? Well, the Koreans, they just said, okay, I'm out of here, and they just left. So on that particular location, there was only 3 guys, myself, the forward observer, and another guy I came along with as a helper or something, but Herky, and there was only 3 of us on the hill. Well, coincidentally, as soon as these Koreans pulled out at 11 o'clock, 2,300 hour, all of a sudden we started getting the shit kicked out of us. And then because the Chinese knew it was top secret, of course. Of course they knew. But then they just shelled the hell out of us. And there was nothing you could do but hunker down. And I had the radio, and we lived in a little bunker, you know, cut out of the side hill. Dirt, you know, all dirt. And a round exploded out there, and the whole corner of the building collapsed. And I could look right out and see the stars. And I thought, holy shit, this is great. You know, so the other guy and I, we hung an army blanket up and stuck it into the thing so at least we could shade it, because the only light we had was a candle. And the next thing you know, they took the telephone line went out. That goes out right away. And then the next thing, they blew my radio antenna down, because now I was actually out of touch with the world. There wasn't anything you could do. There's nobody you could holler to or talk to, and there's no way of contacting them. And they just continued, the Chinese just shelled the hell out of us. And it was uncomfortable. It wasn't scary, but it was uncomfortable. Well, then after that round went out and they took my blanket and we stuck that up, I felt I had to stay by the radio. This is nonsense. The radio was dead, you know? So what the hell could I want to sit by it for? And the FO, forward observer, he hunkered down up in his place, it was a sandbag place, and he just hired it in there. And I was alone in that room. And that's when I got scared to death, because I mean they were shelling us and it was hitting us all over the place, and I was all alone in this damn room with a blanket hanging over there, and I had an M2 carbine, and I sat there by where my radio was, like right here, and I had a chair or something to sit in, so I just sat there in that thing and flip that thing on M2, which is full automatic. And you can put it off of that and you just fire 1 round at a time. If you put it on M2, flip the switch over on the carbine, it just becomes a machine gun. As long as you hold the trigger down, she'll just empty it. Well, I had a 30-round clip in there, and it was just barely a light enough to see with that damn candle burning. And all of a sudden I saw the blanket move, and I thought, Jesus, it's somebody feeling along the wall, and he feels this blanket. And I thought, oh man. And then I was scared because I didn't know, I knew someone was out there, and I thought, next thing they're going to do, what I would have trained to do, is simply, I would have rolled a grenade in, throw the grenade in, and then you can go on in and shoot them up, whoever's there. And he didn't do it. And then it just moved once, and it was still. And then because I guess that terrified me, because then I didn't know. I didn't have something to, it wasn't like being in an electric storm, it's right there. This was not right there. I didn't know what was right there. And I didn't know enough to do anything else but just sit there and hold my breath all night. And the whole damn night I sat with that M2 carbine set on full automatic, and I swung it around and pointed it toward that curtain, and I thought, I don't know who that was, but it wasn't friendly. And I said, if that curtain moves again, I'm just flipping this thing automatic, and I'm just dumping 30 rounds into that hole, and whoever the hell is there has got it. And they're going to come back in after me, but I'm going to get a piece of them. Old saying going, our colored guys that I went to basic with, some guys say, well, you're going to get a meal off of me, but I'm going to get a sandwich off of you. You know, that's okay. That's the way it went. That was that kind of that thing. That was my idea, and I was scared, shitless. I mean, I ain't got afraid to tell you. I was scared to death. And I was 19 years old, and I'm sitting in this damn dirt hole, and that curtain or that blanket had moved. And I thought, boy, because I could barely see it with a candle, but I thought, if it moves again, I'm dumping this whole clip into it. Well, they stopped firing at us. I don't know why they quit. I have no idea. And I still sat there the whole night. I was just like frozen. My eyes were frozen open, and then along toward daylight, I could hear some noise. There's a trench went right by our hoochie that we were in. We called it a hoochie, and it was daylight out. Just breaking day. So I thought, man, I don't know who's out there in the trench, but I better take this carbine and look out there and find out, because if it ain't somebody I know, they're dead, you know. So I went out and said it was a couple of commo guys, communication people. They ran our wire, and one was Jack McQuaid from Pittsburgh. I liked him, nice fella. And I saw him through the light, and I said, Jack, what in the hell are you doing up here? And he said, well, they told me your telephone was out. And I said, well, it is. He said, well, we come up to fix it. And I said, well, thanks a lot. You know, so they ran new wire up for us and put our telephone in, and I don't know, there was other people coming up then, and it was right after that finally the 45th got there. The guys come up the trench with their rifles on their machine gun on the shoulder and stuff. And then I stood there in our opening. Now I had a radio, and they had stopped firing on us. So things were returning back to somewhat normal.
Longtime North Country resident and Korean War veteran Harry Mitchell talking with us back in 2024. He passed away just a few days ago, and we just thought it made sense to revisit this interview on this episode of Northwards. And Ethan Shanty back in the studio with us. Ethan, one of the things that really moved me, I have to say, when I got an email from Harry's daughter, Bambi, that Harry had passed, she said that the thing that's been really interesting is that as the word got out that her dad had died, his friends from all around the country went looking for his obituary, which if it hadn't been, wasn't out yet, what they were finding was the interview
kidding.
that aired, and how glad they were to all hear Harry's voice again.
Yeah, I'd be able to spend just like a few more minutes with them. Yeah, that's awesome. That's one of the reasons I'm glad that we do this show. I mean, often you're talking to folks about the book that they just wrote, or the music that they write, or the concert that they're performing. But oftentimes throughout that, you're getting this sort of secret history of their life, the thing that informed their interest in writing or literature or music.
Yeah, we're really asking about their lives. We're not. I mean, we're asking about their art or their vocation, but really
what we want to know is like who you are and what makes you tick.
Yeah.
I'm glad we get to do stuff like that.
Ethan, thanks. Thanks to everybody for listening to this episode of Northwards. And who puts the show together?
Northwards is an NCPR podcast production. The show is written, produced, and edited by Mitch Tyke, with digital production supervision by me. I'm Ethan Shanty. To find more conversations, listen back, and support the show, visit ncpr.org/northwards. This is NCPR, North Country Public Radio.